I believe there's a hero in all of us that keeps us honest, gives us strength, makes us noble, and finally allows us to die with pride, even though sometimes we have to be steady and give up the thing we want the most.
Heroes. Heroes aren't defined by their powers, or how many love interests they've gotten packed up. They're defined by their perseverance, their ability to inspire others to be better, and their willingness to fight for what's right, no matter the cost. A hero can be flawed, struggle with their inner demons, and question the reason for even fighting. But what sets them apart from villains and even anti-heroes is that while villains show us the worst versions of ourselves, and anti-heroes how low we can go before it's too late, a hero is supposed to represent the best versions of ourselves. Don't get me wrong, villains and anti-heroes have their place in any story. I love an evil villain. I love a not-so-good anti-hero. Majority of people have loved them and will continue to love and glaze them for generations. Enjoying a character, especially a villain or an anti-hero, for the role they play in a story is normal, especially when they're well written. The problem is the obsession within the creation and consumption of modern media with erasing or replacing heroes with an endless orgy of villains and anti-heroes, to the point that people have forgotten the role heroes are supposed to play in stories and why they matter, why heroes are important. For the sake of this argument, let's go over a couple of villains who have been impacted by this trend of disregarding heroes from the perspective of the creation of stories and the perspective of the consumption of stories. Kylo Bitch Boy Ben Solo Ren, a power-hungry, emotionally unstable psychopath who commits war crimes and murders Han Solo, much to Harrison Ford's joy. Yes. In the name of the First Order, while grappling with his identity as he attempts to finish what Papa Darth Vader started. While I would never call Kylo Ren a deeply complex or nuanced character, he did have the potential to grow into a more complex villain. His craving for Snoke's approval, worship of Darth Vader, rivalry with General Hux, the bastard ginger general of the First Order, and his antagonistic relationship with the narrative foil Finn, someone who was raised in darkness but chose the light, contrasting that with him, who was raised in the light yet chose darkness, served as a solid launchpad for what could have been an interesting character journey. The weakest thing about Kylo Ren was his dynamic with Rey, because wherever his relationship went with Rey, it would have to be something more interesting than what we had with Finn, and maybe you could write something up, but then we get to The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker, where Kylo Ren is reframed as the whoopified character, a pathetic figure whose newly artificially created inner conflict and backstory doesn't just overshadow his heinous actions, but undermines all the hard work that went to everything The Force Awakens did to set him up as the character he was by the end of that movie. The shift also undermines the actual heroes of the sequel trilogy. Finn, introduced in The Force Awakens as the male lead, was a stormtrooper turned rebel with immense potential, yet sidelined in favor of propping up Kylo in The Last Jedi and forcing a last-minute redemption arc in The Rise of Skywalker. Many people acknowledge Finn got dealt a bad hand. Sadly, not enough, but what many don't realize is that by pushing Finn to the sideline and propping Kylo up, it didn't just hurt Finn's character or even Kylo's, but the entire narrative of the sequel trilogy. Go back to The Force Awakens, and you realize how much of that film is carried on the shoulders of Finn, pushing the narrative of that movie. Take away Finn, Rey stays on Jakku, or worse, is killed by stormtroopers. Kylo Ren collects the map to Luke and never gets to confront his father about his life choices or Snoke about his conflictions. Similarly, Luke Skywalker, the original hero of the entire Star Wars franchise whose journey inspired generations, is deconstructed and destroyed in order to be transformed to a completely different character that was unrecognizable just so the film could fix him, then kill him off. And all of this is done just because Kylo Ren's status as a villain needed to be changed from something he actively chose into something he was pushed into by Luke, completely missing the point of why Luke Skywalker even mattered to the franchise of Star Wars. The level of destruction done to Luke Skywalker, ironically, was more memorable than his rather generic arc in The Last Jedi, that was done better in films like Logan and Blade Runner 2049, as well as done better in films after The Last Jedi like Into the Spider-Verse and Top Gun Maverick. All of this was done because of one studio's inability to understand the value of heroes, the role they play in stories, and what does and doesn't make a true hero. I would like to say Lucasfilm learned a lesson from this, yet they've mostly continued this trend of either deconstructing heroes to be shadows of their former selves, only to fix them with an arc that has to destroy who the character was to begin with, just to rebuild them in their own image. Or they create a villain who commits horrible actions of evil, yet the filmmaker just can't help romanticizing them, like it's a bad AO3 fanfic, or, if your birth year starts with 19, a bad .livejournal or fanfiction.net fanfic. Thanos from the Avengers films, specifically Infinity War, because Endgame's script is a train wreck and we need to stop pretending like it's not, is a much different example than Kylo Ren in the fact that Thanos in Infinity War is actually a well-written villain. We are not going to talk about Endgame Thanos because, oh boy, Thanos, the Mad Titan, is a villain whose motivations for doing what he was doing was changed from his comic book counterpart and reimagined to appear more logical, even noble by certain audiences, despite the horrifying actions he would be doing. Thanos' plan to erase half of all life in the universe is presented with a veneer of altruism, reducing overpopulation in the universe to prolong life in the universe. While Thanos' reasoning is noble, his methods and solution to this problem is beyond stupid. Stupid beyond reasoning. Overpopulation is a solvable problem without mass genocide. Instead of rejecting his ideology outright, some viewers sympathize with him, believing his logic to be sound, or the ends justify the means. This misinterpretation stems from the film's emphasis on Thanos' complex personality and portrayal, which humanizes him to the point where his villainy feels second to his motivations for many people, who lack the media literacy to understand that not every villain is a cackling madman, like good old Sheev Palpatine. The danger here is not in how Thanos is being portrayed, like how Kylo Ren was treated in the sequel trilogy, but in the audience perception of Thanos. Confusing compelling writing with agreement. Thanos was never meant to be right. His actions are monstrous. Villains are meant to be wrong. But the cultural tendency to glorify villains has muddied the message for some viewers who just can't comprehend that. Which brings us to our next character. I'm sorry Thanos, you were basically just a lead up to the big cheese. In Transformers 1, Megatron's descent to villainy is portrayed as a cautionary tale about ambition and the corrupting nature of power. His initial goals to unify Cybertron and ensure its survival are noble, but his methods become increasingly tyrannical and destructive. He sacrifices his ideals for control, ultimately becoming the very thing he swore to destroy. Yet like Thanos, Megatron's motivations have led some to sympathize with his actions, ignoring the fact that his descent to villainy was meant to showcase his moral failings, not validate his choices. His rebellion is born out of pride and unwillingness to compromise, making him a tragic figure, but not a justified one. The story highlights how ambition without accountability leads to destruction. Megatron is meant to be a foil for Optimus Prime, a hero who embodies humility, sacrifice, and the ability to lead without losing his moral compass. But modern audiences, conditioned to romanticize villains, sometimes misinterpret Megatron's fall as a justifiable response to oppression, rather than a warning about the dangers of unchecked power. Oppression is something you should always fight against, but he who fights monsters should see to it that he does not become a monster. This is where many people lose the plot of what it means to be fighting for what's right, and that brings us to Silco from Arcane. Silco from Arcane is perhaps one of the most nuanced examples of a modern villain. His love for Zahn and desire to see it rise above its oppression makes him a sympathetic character, but his methods, manipulation, violence, exploitation, flooding Zahn with drugs, does even more damage in the long run to Zahn than Piltover. Silco claims to fight for Zahn's freedom, yet his actions perpetuate the cycle of suffering and inequality in the Undercity. Nowhere is that more evident than his relationship with Jinx. While Silco genuinely does love her, in his own creepy, possessive, gaslighting way, his emotional manipulation turns her into the worst version of herself. By fostering her paranoia and weaponizing her trauma, he isolates her from others and pushes her into chaos. Instead of healing Jinx, he shapes her into a tool of his revolution, a tragic reflection of his own moral compromises and failings. And this is ironically what leads to Silco's death. Not his revolution, his own emotional manipulation of a young girl. Silco is a fascinating character, but his sympathetic qualities do not absolve him of his villainy, something many people struggle with, especially given the corruption in Piltover. Silco is the antagonist in Arcane. He is part of the problem within Zahn. Many of Zahn's antagonists are part of the problem that brings down the Undercity. They need to be taken out. There is a reason why Echo, a childhood friend of Jinx, created the Firelights, an organization formed to literally protect the Undercity from Silco and the worst of Zahn, who mean to do it harm. Zahn is a horrible place to live right now, not just because of Piltover's corruption and the disregard for them, but due to Silco and all the people like him who are making Zahn worse. Hashtag Silco was wrong. Now that we've covered the issue with the way villains are being misinterpreted and misrepresented, let's go past the symptoms and get to the cause. Over the years, traditional heroes have often been criticized as boring, naive, or outdated, especially in the age that thinks moral complexity and realism can only come from villains or anti-heroes. Critics argue argue that traditional heroes like Superman, Aragorn, or Luke Skywalker lack nuance because they represent ideals rather than realism, that their unwavering sense of right and wrong can sometimes feel detached from the struggle of modern audiences who live in a world of uncertainty and moral ambiguity. This has led to a rise of morally gray characters in the media, why we seem to have every writer looking to create the next Rick Grimes, Jaime Lannister, Billy Butcher, or Walter White. The misconception being that traditional heroes, those who embody selflessness, courage, and idealism, are irrelevant or one-dimensional and can't begin to compete with the morally compromised characters of today. That being said, like all garbage takes from an edgelord who thinks explicit content makes something mature, or some fake villain fuckers who waters down their villains, everyone wants to call themselves a villain fucker, so it's time to take back shots from Big Jack from Puss in Boots instead of the furry bait. Modern media proves. What the fuck did I just say? Okay. Modern media proves this take wrong, demonstrating that heroes can still be fresh, compelling, and deeply relatable when written thoughtfully and competently. And if there is one series in recent memory that proves traditional heroes can still be interesting and carry a narrative, it is the series Arcane. Arcane is an animated series based on League of Legends, and somehow, despite my criticisms I have here and there for the show's narrative in the second season, it is one of the greatest shows ever created, and the best video game adaptation ever made. Yes, it is better than the Sonic movie. It is better than the Fall TV show, which I also love, and it slaps harder than Cyberpunk Edgerunners, even though Cyberpunk Edgerunners has much better source material, and without question, it makes The Last of Us bite the curve, as it should. Neil Druckmann, may you burn in hell. And within Arcane, there are three great examples of traditional heroes that don't just embody the traits of classic heroes, but also are allowed to have the emotional and moral complexity that many claim modern heroes just can't have. Jace's arc in Arcane is defined by two things: his desire to help people and his obsession with proving himself. Initially introduced as a visionary inventor, Jace's brilliance is matched only by his naivety and his slight vanity. His journey begins with pure intentions, aiming to harness the power of Hextech to bridge the social economic divide between the affluent Piltover and the struggling undercity of Zon. However, his idealism soon clashes with the harsh rise of political power as he is abruptly elevated to the position of counselor. The stress of leadership and moral compromises of council politics begins to chip away at Jace's initial optimism as he is persuaded to conform to the council's corrupt practices. He becomes increasingly disillusioned. This disillusionment is compounded by personal strife. He is tormented by his mentor Heimdallr's refusal to support potential dangerous magical research that could save his friend Victor's life. This conflict reaches a peak when an attack on the council leaves Jace wrestling with survivor's guilt, deepening his sense of isolation and responsibility to the city's well-being. Jace's relationship with Victor also falls apart after he is forced to play God in order to save his partner's life, a choice that Victor feels crossed the line and made their partnership impossible to continue. Things go from bad to worse after a terrible accident leaves Jace trapped in an alternate universe where Victor's actions led to an apocalyptic future. The character is forever changed after enduring months of trauma in this future hellscape, further adding a layer of tragedy to his journey. Sent back by a future version of Victor, Jace's mission becomes to prevent Victor from ending the world and find redemption, not because he feels like he did something evil, but because Jace feels like he didn't do enough. In the end, Jace's story concludes in a poignant resolution. Realizing the gravity of their choices and mistakes, Jace and Victor come together to sacrifice themselves to destroy the Arcane, thus preventing the apocalyptic future. Despite the trials and transformations, despite all the mistakes he made, Jace's final act of self-sacrifice reaffirms his status as a true hero. Courage, perseverance, and a commitment to not just the greater good, but his friend and partner. His journey illustrates that modern heroes can embody the complexity, depth, and can engage the audience with flaws and growth. It also helps that Jace goes from looking like a Magic Mike reject to our glorious, feral, werewolf-looking Italian Latin king. Mel is the most unique and unorthodox heroic example on this list and in Arcane. Presented initially to be what many would perceive as a villain with good publicity, Mel's cunning and persuasive approach to handling her duties as a counselor is ultimately not just for the greater good, but also from an unquestionable desire to not be like her muscle MILF authoritarian twink-pegging mother. That is a fucking sentence. Her character starts the series off as one of the few Piltover politicians who not only wants to create peace and stability between the two cities, but she wants to do it in a way that doesn't require violence. Mel comes from a continent called Noxus, where everyone in that Kingdom Hearts sounding land values strength and conquering everything. Mel choosing non-violent methods isn't just for her own morals or to go against her mother's wishes, but an actual denouncement of her people's ways. Yet Mel's past further complicates her moral and political career when this heartless looking bitch called Black Rose Rose, who is responsible for her brother Kino's death and her own exile from Noxus, reappears, hoping to use Mel in her own war against Mbessa. Mel is fighting a war on two fronts, fighting against the deceptive ways of Black Rose and the dominating, war-hungry muscle MILF of a mother Mbessa that she has. Mel's desire to not sacrifice her integrity and convictions highlights a key aspect of her heroism, the commitment to effect change from within a political seat of power without compromising herself or her morals. This is a rare trait among people in positions of power, who more often than not succumb to the corruption when they are placed in positions where their influence and word grants them almost unlimited power. As Mel's story progresses, she is confronted with the truth of her mother's ambitions and the lies of Black Rose. Mel learns about the murder of her brother, her own unique birth that reveals she is the child of two warring factions that won't stop till the other is dead, and the fact that she has a power like no other inside of her. This revelation marks a turning point in Mel's character, where once she was content to be a passenger in someone else's story, persuading them to move the pieces on the board where she wants them to be moved. Now she's an active player in the game, moving the pieces to where she thinks they need to go herself. Towards the end of the series, Mel battles her mother and sends Black Rose's lying ass back to Kingdom Hearts. Yet despite wanting to show her mother mercy, Mbessa still dies in Mel's arms. Yet her mother passes with pride, happy that her daughter has finally taken her fate into her own hands. In the end, Mel realizes that diplomacy alone is not enough to end all the conflicts, and if there is any hope for true peace, it must be fought for. Mel takes command of her mother's army, takes up her mother's wolf mask, resigns as counselor, and sails back to Noxus. Mel's story may end on a bittersweet note, yet she has become better than she ever could have if the events of Arcane never happened to her. And speaking of bittersweet, let's talk about Arcane's GOAT. Echo is the best character within Arcane, which is ironic because while you could never tell it with the promotion and fan reception, Echo ironically has the least amount of screen time among most of the main characters of the series. Yet every second he's on screen, Arcane is just that much better. Initially introduced as a happy, plucky kid, alongside Vi and Powder, Echo's journey into a cynical young freedom fighter is born from a series of traumatic events that led to the death of his father figure, childhood friends, and the diverging paths of Powder and Vi. All of this turns Echo into a young adult that barely resembles the child he used to be. Like his love interest and narrative foil Jinx, Echo is a character defined by his losses. What he became is a reflection of what he no longer is and what he had to endure. Silco and his crew took everything from him, so Echo created a group called the Firelights to not only help the people of Zaun, who Piltover will not, but also fight against Silco and all those who actively make the Undercity worse. Years of fighting against the worst of Zaun, the very people he's fighting to protect, has left Echo jaded and exhausted. By the time he's reintroduced to the story after a time skip, Echo has lost sight of what he's fighting for, chasing an ideal image of Zaun. This disconnection is mirrored in his treatment of Jinx, who he views as a lost cause, detaching her from his memories of the innocent Powder he cared for, ironically mirroring Jinx's own method of coping with her trauma. Echo's emotional journey deepens when he's faced with an alternate universe where Jinx is still Powder, everyone he loved is still alive, and Zaun is better than he ever could have dreamed of. This glimpse into what could have been forces Echo to confront his repressed feelings for Jinx, and how wrong he was to judge her the way he did in the past. Echo knows he can't stay in this world. It's not his. This Powder isn't his Jinx, and he can't leave the girl he just realized he loves to her own self-destructive behavior. Literally. Echo returns to his universe, determined to save Jinx from killing herself, no matter how many times he has to rewind time. But Echo doesn't just manage to stop Jinx from ending her own life. He also inspires her to embrace her identity, who she is beneath the layers of walls she's built up to protect herself. This moment in the series is the purest example of heroism there is to show, and it marks Echo's growth from a disillusioned freedom fighter to a compassionate hero who understands that true leadership involves empathy and an unwavering commitment to the individuals, not just a cause. Echo solidifies his status as Arcane's MVP in the final battle against Vecta, saving not just Zaun or Piltover, but the entire damn world. Mind you, he did all this in a crop top and matching body paint with Jinx. Echo uniting the people of Zaun with Jinx achieves what neither Silco or Vander could do, finally bringing the people of the Undercity together to fight for their own future. Yet despite all his success, all his fighting, Echo's story ends on a bittersweet note. Most of Echo's friends are gone. The love of his life fakes her death and disappears into the world to find herself. Despite taking the first steps to achieve a better Zaun, it's unknown where a fighter like Echo fits into a place that no longer needs him to protect it, because that is the bittersweet thing of Echo and the Firelights. When their mission is over, where does Echo fit in? Echo's sacrifice and personal losses underline the depth of his complexity. Throughout the entire series, Echo is tested in ways that could and have broken or compromised others, yet he always pushes through, no matter the cost. Echo is a constant reminder that modern heroes with unbreakable convictions don't have to be one-dimensional or outdated. Echo's unwavering dedication and emotional maturity makes him a standout example in a series filled with brilliant characters. And how it does this, and how it does it with all the characters, is relating their struggle, their moral dilemma, and every conviction they have with universal themes that were relevant 50 years ago, relevant 10 years ago, and will be relevant probably 50 years in the future. In a media landscape that frequently romanticizes villains and destroys heroes, Arcane stands as a powerful counter-narrative, demonstrating that modern heroes are far from boring. They can be complex, flawed, and profoundly human while still inspiring hope. The arcs of Echo, Mel, and Jace remind us the endearing relevance of heroes. They embody the best versions of ourselves and empower us to fight for what's right, regardless of the personal cost. Each character represents a unique archetype of traditional heroism, yet each faces their own distinct trials. Heroes are important. They do more than just save the day in stories. They save us from real life. They're a reminder that even in our darkest moments, no matter how much the world changes, no matter how much people change, we will always need a hero.